Okay guys, now we're ready to jump into Lightroom and we're going to be editing two different photos from this photo shoot. We're going to show you how to adjust your highlights and shadows and get them back into proper exposure range, and we're going to show you how to color tone. All right, we got a great section. Let's jump into Lightroom. So to start off, we're going to go ahead down to our Taylor Palm collection here, and here we can see all of our images from the Taylor Palm shoot. Now we have a couple of different styles in this shoot, and basically we've got some images that were shot a little bit closer and some images that were shot a little bit further away. And we're going to be editing a few different styles. So the first thing we're going to do is go through and choose our picks. So let's double click on our first image, and we're just going to scroll left and right until we see our picks. All right, now I really like this image. Our subject's just a tiny bit out of focus, but that sort of thing we can actually change in Lightroom as well. All right, there we go. Facial expression looks good. There's a lot of kind of negative dead space in this, so if we did wind up using this image, I'd probably crop it to be a little bit different, but the facial expression really is nice. There we go, and her facial expression's really nice in that one as well. So let's go ahead back to our library now. It's at G for the grid view, and I'm going to go to our attribute tab, and we're going to go ahead and click on the flag rating. Okay, now let's click on all three images, so Control or Command A, and then hit N for survey view. And again, to get all of our sidebars away, which is what I like to do, I'm going to hit Shift and hit Tab. There we go. Okay, so basically we have this look and we have this other look. And between these two, I'm going to go with this image here. We're just a little bit closer to our subject, and I think her facial expression is just a little more interesting. So hold Control or Command and click on that one as well. Okay, so now we've got two images, and they're pretty different, really. Basically, this is a very clean type image, and this one is a little bit more like we have a lot more vignetting going on. I think there was actually something in front of the camera here, like a little palm frond or something in front of the camera, which is creating this dark spot. But we can do a lot of really cool things with both of the photographs. So let's go start off. I'm going to click on this image and hit the number 5 on my keyboard to give it a 5-star rating, and the same thing on here. So we know that those are the two we're going to work with. Okay, now getting back to our grid view, I'm going to hit G to get back to our grid view. We can take this off, and then I'm going to hit Shift Tab to get everything back. So really quickly, I'm like, okay, this has got 5 stars, that's got 5 stars. It's very easy for me to see what we're actually going to be editing. So we're going to do these one at a time. Starting with this image, there we go. The first thing I want to adjust are the highlight levels and shadow levels. And we're not clipped, and clipping basically is what happens when something is too light or too dark to actually render in the photograph. In this case, we're not clipped. This is not too light, and this area here is not too dark. However, there is a lot of contrast, and I'd like to bring that contrast down just a little bit. So we're going to go into our Develop tab here. Okay, and a good way to see if you're clipped in either your highlights or shadows is by clicking on these little highlight or shadow clipping areas. So it looks like if we show shadow clipping areas, looks like we're clipped just a tiny bit here. And clipping means that you kind of lose detail in that area. That's basically what clipping is. Now, if I click on my highlight, you can see we're good to go. If I were to bring my exposure up quite a bit, you can see we start to clip on our highlights as well. Okay, there we go. And obviously we don't want to do that. All right, let's go ahead and go all the way back to the original. Now, what we're going to do to start off with is to get our highlight level, we're going to bring that down just a little bit. So we're going to take highlights and we're just going to pull these down just a little bit. Next, we're going to take our shadow level and I'm going to bring those up a little bit. And you can see we're losing a little bit of contrast in this photograph, but our tonal range is getting back towards the center. So instead of seeing like a brighter highlight and a darker shadow, we're seeing something that's a little bit more centered. Okay, now that's looking pretty good. The next thing we're going to work on is our color temperature. I'm just going to make this just a little bit warmer. It was a sunny day, okay? And our tint is not really going to come into play here. You know, pulling it green or magenta, this is not really going to benefit us here. So let's go back in time with our history there. Okay, next I'm going to bring a little bit more clarity into our photo, and we're going to bring our black levels up just a little bit and our white levels down. Okay, so we really are kind of reducing the contrast. In fact, I'm going to actually reduce the contrast slider itself. So we are reducing the contrast here. Now I'm going to bring up our vibrance just a little bit to add some more color. There we go. And let's start off by clicking to see the before and after. I'm going to click on the / key, which is right above the enter or the return key. So there's our before and the after. again, the before and the after. You can just see a lot more detail with the highlights, midtones, and shadows in the after. We do have a little bit less contrast, but in this case, I think it totally works. Now, the next thing that I want to do is bring a little bit more color toning into this photo, because we do have nice complementary colors. We've got this red in our subject's shirt here, and we've got the green in the background. So if I can bring some of this red and green into the image, I think it's going to bring everything together really nicely. So I'm going to scroll down here, there we go, until we get to our split toning, and we're going to start off by bringing some color into the shadows. So let's bring up our saturation here. There we go, and we can choose which color we'd like to bring into our shadows. And in this case, because we do have red and green in the photograph, I recommend choosing between red or green as the color you're going to put in the shadows. And in this case, I think red is going to work a little bit better than green. So we're going to choose our red color here. Just go all the way to the right and then choose, there we go, our saturation. And I'd like to add some color into the highlights as well. All right, so we're just going to pull that a little bit towards, maybe a little bit towards like yellowish green, and we'll lower our saturation. We don't need that to be too high. All right, maybe our reds will pull right over there. All right, that's looking good. Now, we're going to go down. I'm going to go ahead and enable our profile corrections for the lens, and it's just going to give us, it's going to kind of, it's going to help our distortion and our vignetting as well. All right. Now, this looks pretty good. We're going to go all the way back up to the top here. I'm going to add a little bit more clarity to the photograph. And you know what? I might just add just a little bit more vibrance. Now that we're seeing enough detail in the highlights and the shadows, I think we're good to go with a little bit more contrast there. All right. And maybe I'm going to pull a little bit less color in my shadows and just a little bit less in my highlights. All right. So this is something that you don't have to get like perfect the first time you edit, but you can always come back to here and start adjusting your sliders. So let's go ahead and take a look at the before and after. I'm going to hit the slash key. So there's a before and the after. Just a nice like color tone. Okay, now in this case, you know what? I do want to bring our contrast down just a little bit more, because this kind of, in my opinion, it lends itself to a little bit more of like a vintage antique type looking photograph. So that's why we're going to kind of lower our contrast here. All right, that looks great. So now we can take this image. I'm going to hit G to get back to our grid view. We can take this and I'm going to hit Control or Command A to select everything. And we're going to go to Sync Settings, and I'm going to go ahead and check everything and hit Synchronize. So it's going to bring all these images back to the same setting. Now, keep in mind, this is kind of like a retro film type of look, and like it's not going to be the type of processing you put on every single photo, but in this case, I think it totally works. In fact, we're going to add a little bit of noise to help it look a little bit even more retro. All right, so let's go ahead and add some noise. We're going to click back here, go back to our Develop tab, and I'm going to scroll all the way down here till we see our noise, or it's called grain here in Lightroom. In Photoshop, it's called noise. Okay. Zooming in, you can see adding some grain. Let's increase the size of the grain and the roughness a little bit, just to help it make it look a little bit more like, there we go, a little bit more like it was actually shot with a film camera. All right, we'll bring our size down a little bit and our amount up. There we go. So this is not something that the effect is not going to look that great when you're zoomed in, but you want to make sure that it works when you're a little bit further zoomed out. All right, that looks great. And I'm going to play around a little bit with some post-crop vignetting just to help kind of center the image around our subject a little bit better. Okay, so let's go back to our grid view here. I'm going to apply those changes to the rest of our photos again. So let's hit Control or Command A to select all. We're going to go to Sync Settings and hit Synchronize, and that's going to apply the noise and the vignetting to our other images. Okay. So that looks great for our first photograph, but our second photo doesn't really need the same treatment. We need to do some different things to our second photo because it looks totally different. So let's go ahead and jump in and show you how to adjust our second photograph. So going back into Lightroom here, we're going to click on our Develop tab, and I'm going to scroll all the way down here till we see the dehaze option. And this is like what we're seeing here in the foreground a little bit. It's just kind of like a little bit hazy. So we're going to be using the dehaze option to basically add a little bit more clarity to this photograph. All right, cool. I think that looks great. And we're gonna change our post-crop vignetting just a little bit because we already did have a bit of vignetting here. Okay, so scrolling back up, let's go back to where we see our split toning here, and we can continue working. Basically, we have the same settings, or really similar settings to the other photo, but you can still go in here and adjust all those settings. Like, don't feel like you have to stick with just one look. You can most definitely use a couple different looks on your photographs. All right, and I kind of like this like bluish green in the highlights. I think it looks pretty interesting. Okay. Now, in this case, our subject's face is pretty dark. Let's bring the saturation down just a little bit on there. Our subject's face is pretty dark. So we're gonna grab a radial filter and make a nice selection right around our subject's face. And we're gonna bring up our shadow level. There we go. And that's not doing a ton, so I'm gonna pop up my exposure just a little bit. All right, and I'm gonna make this just a little bit larger. And we'll bring up our contrast so it matches. It didn't have enough contrast to really match what was going on around it. All right, cool. That looks great. Now I'm gonna grab our adjustment brush and we're gonna paint right over here, right on top of our subject's eyes, because we need to add a little bit more sharpness. So let's go ahead and bring up the sharpness right over our subject eyes, and that's gonna allow us to kind of like see our subject's eyes just a little bit better. All right, cool. That looks great. And let's just add one more radial filter here. There we go. And I'm just gonna bring our exposure up just a little bit here. We'll bring our contrast up there as well. All right. And then I'm gonna grab a graduated filter and grab straight from the bottom and kind of come up a little bit, just like this. And I'm actually gonna give it a color. So clicking on my color, we're gonna give like a nice reddish orange color. All right, and that's gonna kind of help complete the film look a little bit. So bring that over there and then maybe a little bit over there as well. All right, so just adding a little bit of color. I don't like what I did on the top there. So I'm gonna hit Control or Command Z to undo that. All right, and then this color here, I think we can go a little bit less saturated. So I'm just gonna click and drag this down just a little bit. All right, there we go. And let's go ahead and turn that off. And then we'll see about maybe just increasing the contrast just a little bit and the exposure just a little bit on the image as a whole. So you can see we've got completely different images here. I'm gonna we're gonna go back to our library, hit Control or Command and click on both, and then hit C for compare. All right, and Shift Tab to see both of them. So same photo shoot, same lighting, same everything. This is just like a different composition, different type of image than this one. So in this case, we've got two great images. I think I actually prefer this image on the left, even though like technically, as I zoom in here, you'll see it here. There we go. Bring this over. This is a little bit less in focus than this image. So like from a very technical standpoint, this image is a little bit like more in focus, which some people would say better. But I actually prefer this image here on the left a little bit more. It's just a little bit more interesting. Her gaze is more interesting. And the like how this all turns into shadow here on the bottom, and then the shadows on our subject's face. So just a good exercise. Like this may be like the technically better photo, but I think this is the more interesting photo, and this would be the one that I would go with when publishing. So now we can go back and say, okay, this one is gonna get the red label, so I'm gonna hit the number 6 on it. And going back in, there's just one more quick change I'm gonna make. This is a little bit too green here on our skin. So we're just gonna go back and I'm gonna change the saturation just a little bit here so I don't see quite as much of this like bluish green color in the highlights. All right, and maybe we'll add just a little bit more of that red into the shadows. All right, perfect, so there we go. So let's go ahead and click on here, double click on there. I'm gonna just hit the slash key so we can see the original. All right, let's go back into our develop tab. Okay, so the slash key above the return. So there's the before and the after. So you can see we've made a really big difference with this photograph. Before, I would probably have kind of like thrown this photo out because there's a lot of like, yeah, I can't really see her face and this is really dark. But here in the after, I think it definitely works. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the other. So here's the before and the after with that as well. In the after, you know what? I'm going to take the saturation down on the shadows just a little bit. All right, and I'm going to take away a little bit of the grain as well. We don't need to see that much grain. All right, cool. So let's take a look at the before and after with this image as well. Definitely better in the after, but not as stark of a transition as we had with this other image. So now that I made a couple subtle changes here, I'm going to hold Control or Command, click on other images in the series and hit Sync Settings, and it's just going to change the shadow level and the grain level just a little bit. Okay, so there we go, guys. Those are 2 images from this series. So much fun, and we can see how just a little bit of editing can make a huge difference in your photos. All right, guys, we did a couple of big things in this lesson. First, we started off by fixing our highlight and shadow levels, which basically meant the highlights were a little bit bright, the shadows were a little bit dark, so we brought them both kind of in the same range. And then we added split toning, adding some red into the shadows because our subject was wearing red, and then some yellow or some blue into the highlights just gave a little bit more of a split tone look. Thanks so much for watching this section, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Bye, everybody.